So gang, our topic for today is eco-taxes. Now think about why we might be talking about eco-taxes at this point in the class. Remember, we just finished a unit on externalities, right? So obviously this is going to tie into the idea of externalities. So we're talking about applying eco-taxes to limit externalities. So to limit, or maybe just to address externalities. So we're going to talk about eco-taxes. Now, there are other names for eco-taxes. You might see eco-taxes referred to as green taxes. You might see eco-taxes referred to as environmental taxes. So eco-taxes, green taxes, environmental taxes, they're all the same thing. And I will probably use those terms interchangeably. I probably won't always call them the same thing. In readings, they may not always be called the same thing. So just understand that. So what are we really talking about here when we talk about eco-taxes? We're talking about a tax that's placed on an activity that causes environmental damage. So a tax placed on an activity that causes environmental damage. So it's a tax placed on an activity that causes environmental damage. And generally, when we impose these kinds of taxes, there's going to be two potential outcomes. And we're going to look at both. Two outcomes. Well, the first outcome, when we impose an environmental tax, is that we could see a decrease in that activity. We could see a decrease in that activity. Or the second possible outcome is that it doesn't really decrease activity, but it raises revenue. And that would be instead. So we could see a decrease in that activity, or we might not see much decrease in activity, but instead this tax generates revenue. And of course, if we have revenue, then we can use the money to address the environmental damage. So when we think about an eco-tax or a green tax raising revenue, it's really important to talk about how we're using the money. I know that we've talked about the example of the tax on gasoline, right? And how do we spend the money when we collect money from the tax on gasoline? How do we spend it? What do we use it for? What was that?
Infrastructure.
Infrastructure, such as more roads, repairing roads, which encourages driving. Does that really sound like an eco-tax or a green tax? No. So when we talk about using an eco-tax to raise money, we're talking about where that money is going to be channeled toward trying to address the environmental problem. All right? Either way, whether we have kind of case A or case B, does everyone agree that this eco-tax is going to force people to at least partially, it's going to force people to at least partially internalize the cost of their behavior? So when we impose an eco-tax of some kind, it's going to force people to at least partially, maybe not fully, but it's going to cause them to internalize the cost of their behavior. So with externalities, think about what we talked about with externalities. With externalities, right, we saw market failure. And why was it that we saw market failure? What is it that the market can't do? Markets can't force both firms, if they're the decision maker, or the consumer to internalize the externality, right? So markets can't force people to internalize the spillover cost when making decisions. So we use some examples like secondhand smoke, right? So I decide to buy a pack of cigarettes. And in my decision process, do I sit there and in my brain say, wow, I need to think about the spillover cost to others? Do I think that way? No. Can the market make me think that way? Can it force me to think that way? No. So smokers may not, probably usually don't, think about the spillover costs of secondhand smoke to others. And the market can't force people to think about it. It can't force you to internalize it. But can a tax force you to internalize it? At least partially, depends on the size of the tax. But can't a tax help force you to internalize the cost? So that may not be why we tax cigarettes. But if we were putting a tax equal to the externality on cigarettes, wouldn't that force you to internalize this? Yeah. So can we agree then, guys, when we impose these eco taxes, this is related to something we talked about in our introduction, which is the polluter pays principle. So remind me, what is the polluter pays principle? What did we say? What's the polluter pays principle? The person who pollutes has to pay, right? It's pretty simple. So we're basically talking about force the person who generates the damage. So force the person who generates the damage to pay for it. Now, green taxes might not do that perfectly. Not necessarily suggesting that you pay the full cost when we impose an eco tax, but it's better than nothing, right? Better than not having any accountability here. Now, another interesting thing that's talked about in reference to eco taxes is the idea of tax shifting. So you see some discussion when we talk about eco taxes of tax shifting. So this is a possible benefit when we impose eco taxes. It's a potential benefit. We could get this benefit. And what we mean by this, by tax shifting, the benefit we would get would be that we can use new tax revenue. We can use the new tax revenue from the eco tax to decrease other taxes. So we can use this new tax revenue from the eco tax to decrease other taxes. Now, what kind of taxes might we want to decrease? When we talk about decrease other taxes, we're usually talking about decreasing those taxes that are what we call distortionary. So we could decrease the green taxes and use those tax revenues so that we can decrease other taxes, right? We don't necessarily have to generate a lot more revenue. We can substitute. Now, what do we mean by distortionary? When we talk about taxes that are distortionary, we're talking about taxes that distort our behavior. Taxes that distort our behavior. Maybe we're talking about taxes that have bad incentives. Ones that would manipulate our decision making. And I'll give you some examples. So distortionary taxes are ones that distort our behavior and kind of generate bad incentives. They kind of manipulate our decision making in a way that's not necessarily good. So let me give you some examples of potentially distortionary taxes, or ones that economists think of as being distortionary taxes. So an example of a distortionary tax might be the capital gains tax. Now, what's a capital gains tax?
A tax on money made from investing.
Tax on money. So first of all, it's a tax on capital gains. That's kind of a duh, right? So it's a tax on capital gains. And a capital gain is the money made on investments. So we could be talking about, I make a profit on a stock. That would be a capital gain. So I buy a stock, sell it, make money. That's a capital gain. But it's not just investment in the financial market. If I make profit when I sell some land, that's a capital gain. And there's also capital gains related to houses. Now, if you are selling your primary residence and buying a new one, you get an exemption. But if you make a profit on your second home, so let's say when you're selling your beach house. Your beach house is a second home. That's treated like an investment. And so when you make a profit, you're going to have to pay capital gains tax. So capital gains is the money that we make on investments. It doesn't have to be just a financial instrument. So then what's the distortion when we tax these profits? Why might economists say that these are distortionary? What's Kristen?
Well, I don't think we're going to say the same thing, but like if you're selling your beach house, they might sell it for more so that when you take the tax out.
Okay. I mean, I might sell it for more. That's not necessarily a distortion though, right? If somebody's willing to pay $400,000 and maybe I should have really only gotten $375.
I was going to say, we want people to invest.
Ah, we want people to invest, right? So we want people to invest, right? It's good. It stimulates the economy, right? When we tax your benefits, what are we doing? Say it again? Yeah, we're decreasing the incentive, right? So the tax decreases your incentive. So we want people to invest, and having a tax on capital gains decreases your incentive. Now, do I mean it eliminates your incentive? No, I'm not saying it eliminates your incentive, but at the margin, right? At the margin, it is going to distort your behavior. So, some people would say that that is a distortionary tax. And it is. It would be better if we could tax things that weren't distortionary. Another example. Another example of a distortionary tax is a tax on labor income. A tax on labor income. So, everyone agree that your income tax that you pay through your job is a tax on your labor, right? Everyone agree? So, for example, I can give you an example. I definitely have distorted behavior because of the tax on my income. So back in the olden days, when it was time to teach summer school, it was face-to-face. We didn't have online classes back in the day. And we got paid crap to teach them. We still get paid crap, but now they're online, so it's not quite as much work. You don't have to lecture. But I used to have to show up here for like $3,000, which is a pretty small portion of my income. So I'd be giving up my summer for $3,000. Now, think about the tax implication on that $3,000. I'm pretty high income. So I'm going to pay probably, I'm going to guess at the margin, 30-ish% tax. So right there, I'm giving away 1,000 of that 3,000 to the government, and I pay Social Security tax on it and state taxes. So probably out of that $3,000 that they paid me, I'd get to keep maybe 65%. Is that worth my time, guys? Not worth my time. At the margin, we make decisions on our after-tax benefits, right? So do we agree that a tax on labor income is going to distort our labor choices? And I just gave you an example of one. You want me to do extra work for very little money? Nope, not going to. Because I know that 30-something% is coming right off the top. So do we agree that at the margin, it discourages work? Now, I'm not saying it gives us no incentive to work, right? Obviously, I have an incentive to work. I get to keep 65% of my income, but at the margin, it's going to discourage my work effort. So, do we understand what I mean by distortionary taxes? And we've got a number of distortionary taxes in our tax code. So, back to what we were saying, tax shifting. The idea of tax shifting is that we're going to increase eco taxes, things that we want to change your incentive to participate in, and where we make revenue, possibly decrease distortionary taxes. And we can only do that to a degree. But that's the idea of tax shifting. So people would look at this and say, hey, this is a win. It's actually a win-win. Because does everyone agree that the economy would win when we decrease distortionary taxes, right? Everyone agree? The economy is going to win. And who else wins? The environment. Good. The environment. So doing it right, we could potentially have a win-win. And so this is referred to as the double dividend. That we could see a double dividend, a win-win. It's an interesting idea. Now, have we tried this? Not so successfully in our country, but I do have an example. And I found a good one from 1992. It did not work out, but here's an example. There are probably others. But in 1992, it was proposed by Congress that we would increase the gas tax. Now, what do we know about gas? What kind of demand does gas have? Inelastic, relatively inelastic. So do you agree if we tax gas more, we're going to raise money? People are going to cut back a little bit, but you can't cut back very much, right? There's just no way around it. You got to use some gas. So we're going to increase gas taxes, which means we're taxing something that's relatively inelastic, right? And everyone remembers what that means. People that are inelastic are what? Not that price responsive. They're not that price responsive. So I'm going to kind of suck it up, and I might try to get rid of some of my extra miles that I don't really need, but I'm still going to fill up my tank at the end of the day. So let's take that money, and they were proposing that we would instead decrease the Social Security tax. Now, Social Security tax is a tax on income, labor income, right? So this is a tax on labor income. So if the Social Security tax is a tax on labor income, then do we agree that it is, at the margin at least, distortionary? And so this seems like a good idea. Seems like an interesting idea. In addition, so we should talk about the other part of the proposal. The other part of the proposal was also to decrease the income taxes on very low income households. All right. So maybe what we're talking about there is changing the marginal tax rate at the lowest income levels. This didn't pass, so failed. But do you agree that it's an example of tax shifting, right? And there's other examples. I'll just stick to that one so you understand what I'm talking about. So tax shifting, interesting idea. Let's create a double dividend. Decrease some distortionary taxes. Seems like a good idea. All right, so now we need to go back to somebody we've talked about before, Arthur Pigou. And you all know who Arthur Pigou is, right? Because we talked about Pigouvian taxes. So remember what we said about the Pigouvian tax. Well, first we said it was a really old idea, right? And we're talking about something back from the 1920s. And he was a British economist. And his example, the thing that caught his attention that made him think about this was the coal burning factories in England. And specifically, what was happening with people's laundry. Seems like a pretty simple example. But if you lived back in this time and you've got coal burning factories and people, do they have dryers back then? So they're washing their laundry and they're doing what? Hanging it to dry, right? So people are hanging their laundry to dry. And what do they notice when they get their laundry to bring it back in? Kind of smells a little funny. And what else?
It's probably covered in soot.
It's going to be covered in soot. Exactly. It's going to be covered in soot. So, is there a negative externality? Yeah. So he recognized this idea of this negative externality from the coal burning factories. So remember what we talked about, the efficient tax or the optimal tax. The efficient tax or the optimal tax, the one that addresses market failure, is that we need to find what? We need to be able to measure what? The marginal external cost at what point? Because it may not be the same across all
The optimal.
activities. At
socially optimal.
The socially optimal point. So you guys remember this from our last unit, that the efficient tax, or the optimal tax, the one that's going to generate efficiency, the one that's going to address market failure, is that we need to be able to measure the marginal external cost at Q star. And marginal external cost might be upward sloping, so it may not be a constant number. You've got to be able to measure it at Q star. So hopefully you appreciate that this is maybe a little hard to implement. What might make it hard to perfectly implement a Pagouvian tax?
It's hard to estimate.
Yeah, do we agree that it's sometimes hard to estimate a marginal external cost curve? It's hard to estimate. Because think about what we've suggested an external cost curve would look like, a marginal external cost curve. We said that our marginal external cost curve has to be a dollar value, right? And we said that marginal external costs generally look like this. Now, total cost might be easier to estimate, right? But marginal external costs are pretty hard to estimate. Do people do it? Do we have economists that do this kind of work? Absolutely. But to be able to measure with precision, is it likely that I'm ever going to really know the exact Pagouvian tax? Probably not. So sometimes it's hard to estimate, right? Also, what we really want to do, we want to tax the externality, right? So we want to directly tax the externality. That's what's optimal, directly tax the externality. Do you agree that that's also hard to do? Let's think about the example of driving. We agree that driving generates an externality. All right? Because the externality is the what? What's the externality with driving? Brandon, what's the externality from driving? Exactly, it's the CO2 emissions. That's the externality. But most likely, if we decided to impose an eco tax, would we be taxing the emissions? We'd most likely be taxing what?
Carbon-based fuels.
Carbon-based fuels, right? So it's easier to simply tax carbon-based fuels, which is not the same as taxing the externality. Does everyone agree with that? It's not really the same. So this is what we would call a second best solution. Taxing the externality would be our first choice. Taxing the fuel is our second choice. It's easier. But guys, do you agree that two people with two different cars could consume the same exact amount of fuel but have different externalities? How is that possible that two people, both driving cars, both buying 10 gallons of the same exact gas, but they generate different externalities? How's that possible?
Mileage.
Okay, well, let's say not mileage. They both drive 1,000 miles. By 10 gallons of gas, that wouldn't be 1,000 miles. 10 gallons of gas, 300 miles, let's say. Brandon?
More fuel efficient.
Some cars are more fuel efficient, right? I think somebody mentioned different type of car. What kind of cars might be more likely to generate a bigger externality?
Like big trucks.
Big trucks, SUVs. 10 gallons of gas, though. What else?
Didn't one of the articles say it had to do like with like traffic and what type of roads?
What kind of traffic you drive in might also matter. What kind of roads you drive on might matter. What else? What else about your car?
How old it is?
Yeah, how old your car is, right? How old your car is. So do you agree that two people could both buy 10 gallons of gas which means they pay the same tax, everyone agree? They pay the same tax, but they generate a different level of externality. Oops, sorry. Does that make sense to everybody? So what's the first best option? The first best option would be to what, guys?
Figure out how to tax that amount of emissions.
Yeah, so the first best would be tax the emissions. So you'd have to have some kind of measuring device on your car or something like that. Annually go in and have some kind of emissions test to decide, are you higher emissions, lower emissions? The second best is usually easier. Just simply tax the gas in this case. But Pagoovian taxes, a true Pagoovian taxes would have to be what? A tax on what? The actual externality, right? So this is a tax on the externality. So in this case, with the driving example, is a tax on the emissions. Does that make sense to everyone? So Pagoovian taxes, bottom line, they are more of a theoretical abstraction, right? We need to be able to estimate the marginal external cost, which is a hard thing to do, right? Because you're saying this is the optimal point. I need to be able to measure that amount right there, that marginal amount. That's difficult, but people do work on that kind of stuff. And you need a first best approach, where usually we see second best approaches, right? So we tend to see this, second best approaches. Everyone agree that that second best approach is far easier to implement. All right? Everyone got this? All right. So let's think about some political objectives then. When we think about who might impose a tax, we're talking about Congress. Let's think about the political objectives. So the first objective of an eco-tax might be to have some kind of, we'll call it a cost covering charge. We might implement an eco-tax so we can have a cost covering charge. And basically what we're talking about there is that we're charging the consumer or producer for the cost of some environmental service or abatement measure. So we're going to charge the consumer or the producer for the cost of some environmental service or abatement charge. So usually we're talking about some kind of user fee. It may not seem like a user fee because it's in the form of a tax. And clearly we're going to kind of earmark the money to cover these costs, right? And everyone knows what I mean by earmark, right? So you pay something and that money goes directly for dealing with this environmental issue. So an example, and I don't know if this is still the amount, but in Virginia, you pay a used tire fee. And when do you pay this used tire fee, guys? When you go to buy a new tire. So you're going to pay this when you go to get a new tire. Now, what if I tell them, no, I'll keep the tire because I'm going to make a swing for my children in the backyard. Do you still pay this tax? You do. You do. Because I asked one day when I was there. Now, it used to be small, so it used to be 50 cents. Have no idea what it is now. That's, of course, per tire. It's probably significantly higher now. Maybe it's $1.50 a tire or something like that. But this is the kind of example. It's a cost-covering charge. Why do they charge this? What's the issue? What's the issue? What was that? Yeah, we've got to deal with tire disposal.
What is abate?
Abatement, to eliminate something, some abatement measure. Eliminate some issue, some source of pollution. Clean it up. Deal with it. So it could mean a lot of different things in this context. So tire disposal, what's the issue here? Because if we just give you back your old tire, you're going to dump it somewhere or you're going to burn it. That's not good. So the government wants us to collect some money and take your tire, and then they'll deal with it. Now, I can't swear that we handle tire disposal very well, but we've tried some interesting things. At one point there was an experiment using tires to build artificial reefs. Now, I've been in countries that have worked on artificial reefs. We were in Thailand, and they're actually kind of sinking these cement structures, and hopefully things start growing on them and it's starting to regrow reefs. So they were thinking, okay, let's try that kind of approach with tires. So they were strategically dumping tires into the ocean, but the problem is that tires are round and they roll. And what was happening is they were rolling away and then breaking off pieces of coral from other areas that were healthier. So it was a bit of a flop. We have tried chopping them up and, trying to use them in other ways of making roads and asphalt, and there's some of that going on, and I don't know how successful, but probably some of this money goes to disposal. Some might go to testing, experimenting, who knows what. All right, that's what we mean by a cost covering charge. You get the idea. Another example that I came across was aircraft noise. So remember, noise can be a negative externality, right? And so aircrafts, same kind of thing. These would be fees that are charged. I don't remember if they're charged directly to the airline and then you kind of pay part of it as the purchaser, or if they come on the ticket. But there are airline noise abatement measures where people pay taxes, and then what they do is they take the money and they try to create strategies to limit the noise. So we're going to take the money and use it for noise reduction strategies. And so some of that could be buffer zones. Some of that could be big walls that are built for trying to contain some of the noise, lots of types of things. So there's just two examples. All right, so our first political objective, some kind of cost covering charge. We're just going to directly charge people who are involved in generating the externality, and then we're going to take that money and we're going to clean it up. Now, a second example of a political objective that we might see is that we might be interested in an incentive tax. And if we impose an eco-tax as an incentive tax, then clearly what we're trying to do is increase the cost of a damaging activity with the hope that if we increase the cost through the eco-tax of this damaging activity, then we will change behavior of consumers and we will see a decrease in consumption of this activity or good. So let's use the eco-tax to raise the cost. We know that the law of demand says that when prices go up, quantity demanded goes down, right? So let's simply exploit this idea of the law of the demand. So we have some interesting examples of these. And a famous example is CFCs. What are CFCs? What are CFCs, Brandon? They are I'm going to hopefully spell this right. No wait. Now I'm getting it messed up.
I think it's OURA.
It is, I can't remember what the first C stands for. It's fluorocarbons. Now my old brain that looks like Swiss cheese is just dumping things. You're going to look that up for me really quick? CFCs. Fluorocarbons, I think. I think that might be right, which sounds really weird coming out of my mouth right now.
It's chlorofluorocarbons.
Say it again?
Chlorofluorocarbons.
All right, let's get this right. Say it one more time.
Chlorofluorocarbons. Do you want me to
Fluorocarbons. There we go. Chlorofluorocarbons. Yes. Okay. That sounds right to me. Chlorofluorocarbons. I don't know if I spelled it all right. It's probably CHL, right? Yeah, it should be CHLORO. Fluorocarbons. No one ever says that, right? They just say CFCs. So I had to go back in my brain, and clearly my brain failed me, which happens way too often these days. Y'all enjoy being young and beautiful, because it's going to end, and then you're going to be me. All right, so chlorofluorocarbons, we're going to call them CFCs. I can say that. CFCs. What's the issue with CFCs? Why do we not like them? They destroy the ozone layer, right? So, they destroy the ozone layer. Sandy, why do we care about that?
Because the ozone layer reflects harmful rays.
The ozone layer reflects the harmful rays from the sun. So if we destroy the ozone layer, what happens? What happens?
It gets hot down here.
Okay. So if we destroy the ozone, then it gets hotter. And what else? More radiation.
There's health risks like
health
skin
risks,
cancer
good.
and stuff.
Health risks. All right, you get the idea. Clearly, we do not want to destroy the ozone layer and suffer all of the problems that that's going to generate, right? But CFCs were contributing to the depletion of the ozone layer. So, we decided to phase out CFCs. And how did we do that? By imposing eco-taxes. And interestingly, those eco-taxes started small, and then they got really big. So this kind of happened a little bit gradually over time. But the beauty of it is that when we impose these eco-taxes on CFCs, producers did what? What did producers do? What did producers do? They stopped using them. It works beautifully, right? So producers stopped using. They substituted away. So they substituted away from CFCs. So this was a real success story. But do you agree that it was an incentive tax? Did we say, hey, let's impose taxes on CFCs to make a lot of money? Was that the goal? We actually wanted just the opposite. We didn't want to make any money on that tax, right? Because if we're making money on the tax, then that means what?
They're using CFCs.
Producers are still using CFCs. Not the point, right? We want people to stop using them. All right, excellent. And so the third category, in terms of political objectives, is that we might be imposing what we call a fiscal tax. A fiscal tax. So the opposite of an incentive tax would be a fiscal tax. The goal of a fiscal tax is to raise revenue. So the primary goal, raise tax revenue. So we're looking for money here. So if we impose a fiscal tax, then the goal is to raise money and then use that money accordingly, right? Use that money to deal with the issue or tax shift, do some of each. So do we agree that a fiscal tax is the opposite of an incentive tax, basically? Right? You're not going to have both, because if we're generating money, it means that the incentive didn't work, right? But sometimes we know the incentive's not going to work. So some examples here we've already talked a little bit about. One example would be a gas tax. Do we agree that we're going to have relatively inelastic demand? And if we have relatively inelastic demand for gas, what does that mean? Are consumers price responsive or not that price responsive? What does it mean when we say inelastic? Yeah, so consumers are not that price responsive. So we're taxing something that we know has an inelastic demand, and consumers aren't that price responsive. Now, does that mean they're not going to cut back at all? Is that what it means, inelastic? No, because we didn't say perfectly inelastic, right? So we want to be clear that you might see some decrease, right? You might be seeing some economizing on gas. Right? I mean, you've got people who are going to buy more fuel efficient cars. Right? So you're going to buy more fuel efficient cars maybe, but not right away. Right? You're not going to go run out the door and say, oh my gosh, there's an eco tax on gas, I better go buy a new car right now. But when you go to buy a new one, you probably are thinking about that. Maybe you do more carpooling. Maybe you try to decrease the extra trips you make. So I'm not trying to say that when people have an inelastic demand for gas that they do nothing, that they don't respond at all. But we agree that the response is not that big. So the response to the eco tax isn't going to be that big. So guys, remind me why. From ECON 217, what's our explanation for why gasoline is relatively inelastic in demand? What is that about? What about substitutes? Ah, right, there are relatively few substitutes for gas. Right, there are relatively few substitutes for gas. Now, there are some substitutes: biking, walking. What else? Electric cars. But do we agree that there's really no close substitute, right? Mm-hmm. There's some substitutes. They're few, but there's no close substitute. We should add maybe mass transit. Not in our area, of course, but mass transit is a substitute. So if we're going to impose an eco tax on gas, do you agree that it's going to be mainly, not only, but mainly a fiscal tax? People might cut down a little bit, but it's going to be limited. So guys, help me think through this then. What's going to determine if something is an incentive tax or a fiscal tax? Elasticity? Is that relevant here?
I guess if you're trying to raise revenue or if you're trying to eliminate the...
Well, my objective matters, but what I'm asking is, what is it about the marketplace, I guess, that is going to determine if it's a fiscal tax or an incentive tax? How would I know if somebody comes up, Brandon's our congressman, and he says, I have this idea, let's tax X. As an economist, what's going to help me decide, wow, that sounds like it's going to be a fiscal tax, or, I think that's going to be an incentive tax? What's going to help me decide that? Or I'm hired to evaluate a proposal. And so I need to sit down and think about what? What's going to determine if something is really a fiscal tax or an incentive tax?
If it actually changes behavior?
If it actually changes behavior, true, but I'm being hired to figure out, to tell people, will it change behavior or not? Will it be fiscal or will it be incentive? What's important for me to think about? What might I need to measure? Well, what makes the gas tax a fiscal tax? That there's no substitutes, so people have an inelastic demand, right? What made it easy for people to substitute away from CFCs? Substitutes were plentiful.
They also had time because it was like phased out, I guess.
And time. So what does that tell us about elasticity? It's more what? When people have substitutes that they can move to, and when they have more time to adjust, that makes people more what? From Econ 217, what do we learn? It makes us more what? More sensitive to price, which means more what? More price sensitive, which means more price responsive, to go with what Patrick said, which I think is the same thing I just said, but that's okay, I'll play. More price responsive, And all of that wraps up to me as an economist, tells me what? That they are more elastic. Which I know you said 5 minutes ago, but y'all did not all say it. Y'all lies. You two may have said it, but a whole bunch of other people are looking at me like I am from Mars. All right. So, if I'm hired to look at a proposal and tell people the effects of this proposal, will this be an incentive tax or will this be a fiscal tax? It's probably all going to come down to what? Are people elastic or inelastic? And that probably is going to be driven by what? Availability of substitutes, right? Availability of substitutes. Probably comes down to the availability of substitutes. So if I want to impose a fiscal tax, if my goal is a fiscal tax on something, then I need to be looking at things that are what? Inelastic. Things that cause environmental damage for which consumers have inelastic demand. But if I want an incentive tax, then it has to be what? Has to be elastic, or I'm not going to get the result I want. Okay, we'll pretend that Patrick gave us the right answer. Good job, Patrick. And you see I'm recording this on lecture too. So forever. That was Patrick Clark, by the way. He did not give me the right answer. All right. So let's look at this graphically. So let's say that we impose an eco tax on good X. And let's even keep it simple. Let's make an excise tax. Everyone remember what we mean by excise tax? An excise tax, a simple excise tax, is going to be one that what? Constant per unit. So it's going to be constant per unit. There are other ways to do it that would be a little bit more complex and sophisticated. But a simple excise tax is constant per unit. And let's even make it $2. So it's going to be $2 per unit. It's a constant eco tax per unit. So let's draw ourselves a good size graph. For those of you drawing these little bitty graphs that don't show you anything, stop doing that. Draw a nice big graph. So let's say that we have our upward sloping supply curve. Let's just draw it elastically. We're not that interested in elasticity of supply at the moment. And let's put in a demand curve that looks like this. It's fairly steep. Now it's got to be downward sloping, but draw it pretty steep. So if you didn't draw it steep enough, you need to. All right. So we know that our market equilibrium is here at point A. Let's label our price P0. Q0. All right. So this is our supply curve before the tax. All right. Now, this is where some of you went wrong on test 1. I have an upward sloping supply curve. How do I show a tax? What did we learn? A tax is going to be a shift which way? Vertically, right? So, let's come in here and impose a tax. And it's going to be the same amount at each unit. So, what do I know about my after-tax supply curve? It's shifting vertically and it's parallel, right? some of you couldn't impose a tax on test 1 because all of a sudden I gave you an upward sloping supply curve. But if you understand how to illustrate a tax, then this is easy. All right, so does everyone agree? We're now at point B. And we have a new price of P1. And quantity is Q1. So, what kind of elasticity are we working with here? Is this demand curve relatively elastic or is it relatively inelastic? Inelastic, right? So, in this example, demand is relatively inelastic. Is it perfectly inelastic? Would that be fair to say? Perfectly inelastic? No. How do I know it's not perfectly inelastic? Brian?
Because quantity demand still changed by small.
Quantity demanded still changed a little bit. And how would I draw a perfectly inelastic demand curve? Vertical, right? It looks like a straight line vertically. All right. So demand here is relatively inelastic. And do you agree that we see a large price increase? We see a large price increase. But a very small quantity decrease. Everyone agree with that? So what kind of tax would this be? What political objective is being met here? Is this a fiscal tax or incentive tax, guys? Fiscal tax or incentive tax? Some of you are saying fiscal. What's the objective of a fiscal tax?
Make money.
To make money. What's the objective of an incentive tax?
To change an activity.
To change behavior significantly. Has behavior changed significantly? And we see very small decrease. So what's the bigger effect? Is this raising money or is it changing behavior?
Raising money.
Yeah. So this is an example of a fiscal tax. Now I don't want to slight that. There's a slight change of behavior, but this is really a fiscal tax, right? This is going to raise money. Now, let's get a little bit harder. Let's say that this is, P0 is $10. I want to know, is P1 equal to $12? Right? Our tax is $2. Right? So I know that our tax is $2. Is P1 equal to $12? Yes or no? How many of you say yes? Raise your hands. How many of you say no? You're going to say no? Do you have a reason for saying no?
Because isn't some of the costs might be like captured by the producer? I don't know.
Well, let's think about it.
Same distance.
What's the implication? If P1 is $12, then what were producers able to do? They passed what? This would imply that they passed the full tax to the consumer. Well, let's take a look. Now everyone pay attention to this because this is important. You need to be able to work with these graphs. Do you agree that this distance right here in blue is $2? Because the vertical distance is the tax. So, wouldn't that mean that this distance is $2? Right? So let me ask you again, is P1 equal to $12? Is it? Is
No.
P1 equal to $12? Well, how could it be if the blue line is $12? Does everyone agree that this blue line would have to be $12, right? That would have to be $12, right? Because we've added the $10 price of P0, added the $2, and that would get us to the blue line. But we're not at the blue line, we're at the red line, P1, right? So you should get the answer no. P1 is not $12. And the reason it's not $12 is because the full tax isn't passed to consumers. So if the full tax isn't passed to consumers, then I want to know how much of the tax was passed to consumers. How much of the tax was passed to consumers? So take a look at this graph. How much of the tax? Can I estimate? A lot is not an answer. A lot is a relative concept, right? I drank a lot of coffee today. For you, it'd be like, geez, Dr. March, that's not very much coffee. So, can I look at that and estimate it? Use your graphical skills.
Definitely a majority of the two.
Ah, okay, we can say a majority. That's better than a lot. Senior econ major, a lot. Okay, so Sandy said a majority of the tax has been passed on. I want a number. You can estimate it, right? You know how much is $2, so how much of the tax was passed on? Everyone agree that this amount was passed on, right? $1.80? Looks a little more like $1.50-ish, $1.60-ish. And you don't have to be precise. You're fine if you're not precise. I think this looks more like $1.60, but whatever, you get the point. If you had told me 40 cents, that would be really wrong, right? So I would say here about $1.50, $1.60, $1.70, you know, who knows, something in there. What I'm saying is that your answer better match your graph. You need to be as precise as you can be. So if $1.50 to $1.70 was passed off to the consumer, then who paid the rest? Yeah, the rest is eaten by the producer. So the producer paid about 50 to 30, somewhere in there. But I'm going to ask you to be precise. So in this example, you would need to tell me consumer, producer. If you think that the consumer paid $1.60, then that means the producer paid 40, because this all needs to add up to the $2 excise tax. All right, now, last thing here. On the graph, let's use a different color. On the graph, or maybe not. Oh, okay. On the graph, not saved by the projector. Can we show the tax revenue? On the graph, can we show the tax revenue? On the graph, can we show the tax revenue? We know that it's got to be a box, right? The tax revenue is going to be, right? The tax revenue has to be $2 multiplied by what? What quantity? Q1, right? The new quantity after we impose the tax. So our tax revenue has to be a box, right? that has a height of $2 and a length of, doesn't like me writing down here, okay, a length of Q1. Well, we know where the tax is, right? It's that distance right there. Everyone agree? That's $2. Right? I could measure right there. Everyone agree? Do you agree that that's the box that represents the tax dollars? So that green box is the money that's going to the government, right? But it's being split between producers and consumers. So can we show the portion that's going to government from consumers? The portion coming from consumers, do we agree? They're paying from P0 to P1. Everyone agree with that? Multiplied by Q1. So consumers are paying that portion of the green box. So can we show the portion paid by producers? Sure can.
So the green, that's the government revenue.
Yeah, because it's, remember, the green box is $2 multiplied by Q1. Everyone agree? So right here we've shown how much is going to be made by the government from this eco tax and how that tax is divided between consumers and producers. All right, please take a look at your announcements so you know what your homework is. Consumers are not paying $2. They are paying the portion that is passed on to them, and the producers eat the rest. Does that make sense?
So like you need to take out and make it like a.
This hurts.